The rescue. Captain James sat in the cockpit of his aging starship, the Eclipse, staring at the flashing distress signal on his monitor. It was coming from a crumbling asteroid facility deep within a restricted zone, a place no one sane would venture into. But the message was urgent, a single word repeated over and over: help. James sighed, running a hand through his messy brown hair. He wasn't a hero, not anymore. The galaxy was full of people in trouble, and most of them didn't want to be saved. But something about the signal tugged at him. Maybe it was the desperation in the voice, or maybe he just couldn't ignore someone in need. The Eclipse approached the asteroid. The facility looked ancient, its structure barely holding together in the asteroid's weak gravity. Metal beams jutted out at odd angles, and sparks flickered from damaged power conduits. As James docked, he grabbed his plasma pistol and a flashlight, his cybernetic left arm humming softly as it powered up. It wasn't fancy, but it got the job done. Inside, the place was worse than he expected. The walls creaked as if the whole facility was ready to collapse. The air was thin, and the faint smell of burning metal lingered. James followed the signal deeper into the complex, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Every now and then, he passed shattered control panels and debris, signs that something, or someone, had been here before. "Hello," he called out, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Anyone alive in here?" A faint voice answered, weak and trembling. "Please, help me." James quickened his pace, his flashlight slicing through the dark. He found her in a corner of the facility, trapped under a heavy metal beam. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to glow faintly. Her face was pale, and her breathing was shallow. "Hang on," James said, kneeling beside her. "I'll get you out." The woman shook her head. You shouldn't be here. They'll come back." "Who's they?" James asked, already working to lift the beam. It was heavier than it looked, and his cybernetic arm whirred loudly as it strained against the weight. "The ones who destroyed this place," she whispered. "You need to leave, or they'll kill you too." James gritted his teeth. "Not without you." The beam shifted slightly, but it wasn't enough. Sweat dripped down his face as alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility. A robotic voice announced, "Structural collapse imminent. Evacuate immediately." "Great timing," James muttered. He looked at the woman. "What's your name?" She hesitated, as if she didn't want to answer. "Lyra." "Well, Lyra, if you want to live, I need you to trust me," James said, adjusting his grip on the beam. His arm's servos whined in protest. He knew it wouldn't hold much longer. With a final push, the beam moved, but not enough to free her. James looked at his arm, then at Lyra. There was only one way to get her out. "This is gonna cost me," he said, activating a hidden mechanism in his arm. The cybernetic limb detached with a hiss, falling to the ground. With both hands free, James used his remaining strength to shove the beam off Lyra. She gasped as she crawled out, her body trembling. You didn't have to do that." "Yeah, well, I like my limbs optional," James said with a wry smile. "Let's move." He helped her stand, but she was weak. Leaning on him, they stumbled toward the exit as the facility groaned and shook around them. Debris rained from the ceiling, and James fired his pistol at a collapsing walkway, clearing their path. "Almost there," he said, half carrying Lyra toward the docking bay. The Eclipse loomed ahead, its engines humming to life. James shoved Lyra inside, slamming the airlock shut behind them, just as the facility gave one final deafening roar and collapsed into itself. The Eclipse shot away from the asteroid, the explosion lighting up the darkness of space. James slumped into the pilot's chair, breathing hard. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Why did you do that?" she asked quietly. "You didn't even know me." James glanced at her, his face unreadable. "Guess I've got a thing for people in trouble." Lyra looked away, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't know what you've done." "What's that supposed to mean?" James asked, frowning. Before she could answer, a proximity alarm blared. James turned to the monitor, his stomach sinking. A fleet of ships had appeared on their radar, closing in fast. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Lyra met his gaze, her glowing green eyes filled with regret. "You saved the wrong person." The escape. The Eclipse shuddered as blaster fire rained down from the enemy ships closing in. James cursed under his breath, yanking the controls hard to the left. The ship barely avoided another barrage, its shield sparking from the impact. He had no idea who Lyra was or why these people wanted her, but one thing was clear: she was trouble. Behind him, Lyra sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, staring at the radar. Her glowing green eyes betrayed no fear, only a deep, unsettling calm. "Mind telling me what the hell is going on?" James snapped, his hands moving frantically over the controls. "Because I didn't sign up to get blown to bits today." "They're not here for you," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "They're here for me." "Yeah, no kidding. Why?" James growled as the ship's warning systems blared again. He dove into an asteroid field, weaving through jagged rocks to throw off the pursuit. Lyra hesitated, then sighed. "It's complicated." James shot her a sharp glare. "Lady, I just lost an arm pulling you out of that death trap. Complicated doesn't cut it. Talk." Before she could answer, one of the enemy ships fired a precision shot, grazing the Eclipse's engines. The ship bucked violently, alarms screaming in every corner. James cursed again, wrestling the controls. "We're not gonna last long at this rate," he muttered. "Hold on." He pushed the ship into a steep dive, narrowly avoiding another asteroid. Lyra suddenly reached over, her hands moving with alarming speed across the control panel. "What are you doing?" James barked. "Saving us," she said simply. The Eclipse's engines roared as Lyra activated an emergency burst of power. The ship rocketed forward, leaving the enemy ships momentarily behind. James stared at her in disbelief. "How did you do that?" he demanded. "That wasn't in the ship's systems." Lyra didn't answer. Instead, she pointed at the radar. "We're not safe yet. More are coming." James gritted his teeth. "Great. Any more surprises you want to spring on me, or are we just winging it?" Lyra finally turned to face him, her expression soft but serious. "You're right. You deserve the truth." She took a deep breath. "I'm not human." James blinked, his brain struggling to process her words. "What?" "I'm not human," she repeated. "I'm from another world. And those ships, they're here to take me back, or kill me." "Fantastic," James muttered, shaking his head. "I rescue a damsel in distress, and she turns out to be an alien fugitive. Just my luck." Lyra's calm facade cracked for the first time. "You don't understand. If they catch me, it's not just my life at stake. It's my people's, my planet's, maybe even yours." "Why?" James asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "Why are you so important?" Before she could answer, the radar lit up again. More enemy ships appeared, closing in fast. This time, they were accompanied by drones, small, agile machines designed to disable fleeing targets. "We'll talk later," Lyra said, her voice suddenly commanding. "For now, focus on flying." James snorted. "Flying? Lady, I'm about to perform a miracle." He pushed the Eclipse to its limits, diving into the densest part of the asteroid field. The drones followed, zipping between rocks like angry hornets. Lyra watched silently, her hands gripping the seat tightly. One of the drones locked onto them, firing a magnetic harpoon that latched onto the ship's hull. James cursed again, trying to shake it off, but the drone's grip held firm. "We're not gonna make it," he muttered. "Yes, we will," Lyra said, standing up. "Sit down," James snapped. "You'll get yourself killed." Lyra ignored him. She walked to the back of the cockpit and placed her hand on the wall. To James's astonishment, a faint light spread from her palm, coursing through the ship like veins of energy. The Eclipse shuddered, then surged forward with a sudden, unnatural speed. The drone detached and spun out of control, crashing into an asteroid. James stared at her, his jaw practically on the floor. "What the hell did you just do?" "I told you," Lyra said, sitting back down. "I'm not human." The Eclipse finally broke free of the asteroid field, the remaining enemy ships falling behind. James let out a shaky breath, his mind racing. "So let me get this straight," he said, his voice laced with disbelief. "You're some kind of alien. You've got a whole fleet trying to kill you. And you've got magic powers." Lyra tilted her head, as if considering his words. "It's not magic. It's complicated." "Of course it is," James muttered, slumping back in his seat. "You know, I really should have stayed in bed today." Lyra gave him a small, almost apologetic smile. "Thank you for saving me." James waved her off. "Yeah, well, don't thank me yet. Something tells me this is just the beginning." As if on cue, the ship's long-range sensors lit up with another warning. A massive vessel was approaching, dwarfing anything they'd seen so far. Lyra's calm demeanor faded, replaced by a look of pure dread. "What is it now?" James asked, dreading the answer. Lyra's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's their flagship. They're not going to stop until they have me." James stared at the screen, a sinking feeling in his gut. Fantastic. Just fantastic. Secrets revealed. The Eclipse drifted in the shadow of a colossal gas giant, hidden in the thick bands of swirling red storms. Inside the cockpit, James sat slumped in his chair, his one remaining hand gripping a cooling mug of stale coffee. The quiet hum of the ship's systems was the only sound, but it did nothing to settle his nerves. Lyra stood by the viewport, her glowing green eyes fixed on the raging storm outside. She hadn't said a word since they escaped the last wave of pursuers, and James wasn't sure if that was a good thing or bad. "All right," James said, breaking the silence. "We're out of immediate danger, for now. But I think it's time you start explaining. Who are you really, and why is half the galaxy trying to kill you?" Lyra didn't turn to face him. Instead, she pressed a hand against the glass, her fingers tracing the chaotic patterns of the storm. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." James leaned forward, his patience wearing thin. "Lady, I've seen you light up like a damned firework and supercharge my ship. I'm pretty sure I'm past the point of disbelief." Lyra sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. "I didn't want to involve you. You've already sacrificed so much." "That's not an answer," James said, his tone sharp. "You owe me the truth." Finally, she turned to face him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the cockpit. "I'm Lyra of Erinder, princess of the Valyrian people." James blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. "A princess? Seriously?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "My people are different. We possess a connection to the energy of the universe. It's what allows us to do the things you've seen. But it's also what makes us targets." James set his mug down, leaning back in his chair. "All right. So you're royalty. That still doesn't explain why they're hunting you." Lyra hesitated, as if the next words were too heavy to speak. "My family ruled Erinder for generations, protecting the balance of power in our galaxy. But there are those who want to exploit our abilities, to use them as weapons." "And you're one of those weapons?" James asked, his voice quiet. She nodded. "The most powerful one. When the coup began, my family was betrayed by those we trusted. My parents, my siblings. They're all gone." Her voice cracked, but she quickly composed herself. "I escaped, but not without a cost. Now, the warlords who took my home are hunting me, hoping to use my power to conquer everything." James ran a hand over his face, his mind reeling. "Great. So I didn't just save a random stranger. I saved the galaxy's most wanted fugitive. Lyra stepped closer, her expression softening. I never asked for this. All I want is to stop them before they destroy everything. And I need your help. James barked out a humorless laugh. My help? Lady, I'm just a guy with a beat-up ship and half an arm. I think you've got the wrong hero. You're more than you think, Lyra said, her voice firm. You risked everything to save me. That means something. Before James could respond, the ship's proximity alarm blared. He spun his chair toward the console, his stomach sinking. A massive enemy ship had entered the system, scanning the gas giant's storms. They found us, Lyra whispered, her voice filled with dread. James cursed under his breath, quickly plotting a course out of the system. All right, princess, if we're doing this, you'd better be ready to fight. Lyra's glowing eyes met his. I've been ready my whole life. As the eclipse roared to life and dove into the swirling storm, James couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than himself. The pursuit. The eclipse drifted silently through a graveyard of derelict ships, their broken hulls floating lifelessly in the cold void. James gripped the controls tightly, his eyes scanning the radar for any sign of their pursuers. The silence felt oppressive, a calm before the storm. This place gives me the creeps, James muttered, glancing at Lyra. She stood by the viewport, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her green eyes. You sure this is a good hiding spot? No one would dare enter the wreck field willingly, Lyra replied, her voice distant. But they will follow us. They always do. James shook his head. Great. So we're sitting ducks in a floating scrapyard. Perfect plan. Before Lyra could respond, the ship's proximity alarm let out a sharp beep. James stiffened, his eyes snapping to the radar. 3 blips appeared, moving fast. They're here, Lyra said quietly, her tone resigned. Yeah, I noticed, James said, already powering up the engines. Hang on. The eclipse surged forward, weaving through the maze of shattered vessels. The pursuing ships followed, their sleek designs contrasting with the jagged debris around them. Blaster fire lit up the void as they opened fire, the glowing bolts narrowly missing the eclipse. James gritted his teeth, maneuvering the ship through impossibly tight spaces. I hope you've got a plan, princess, because this isn't exactly my idea of a fun time. I do, Lyra said, her voice calm. Keep heading for the largest wreck. I'll handle the rest. James shot her a skeptical glance. You'll handle it. Care to elaborate? She didn't answer. Instead, she moved to the back of the cockpit, her glowing eyes focused, her hands clasped tightly together. James had no time to argue. He trusted her, but barely. The largest wreck came into view. A massive battleship split in two, its jagged edges looming like the jaws of some ancient beast. James swerved the eclipse into its dark shadow, the pursuing ships closing in behind them. They're too fast, James growled. I can't outrun them. You don't have to, Lyra said, placing her hand on the ship's wall. That same faint light from before began to spread, but this time it was brighter, more intense. The eclipse vibrated as if alive, and James felt the hair on his neck stand on end. What are you doing? He demanded. Trust me, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Just keep us steady. The pursuing ships rounded the edge of the wreck, their blasters ready to fire. But before they could, the wreck itself began to stir. Metal groaned and shifted as if some long-dormant energy had been awakened. Pieces of the broken battleship floated together, forming an impenetrable wall between the eclipse and their enemies. James stared in awe as the massive wreck came alive, the metal fragments moving with purpose. The pursuing ships tried to navigate the shifting debris, but it was no use. One by one, they were crushed or sent spiraling into the void. When the last of the enemy ships was destroyed, the wreck returned to its lifeless state, drifting once more in the silence of space. Lyra slumped against the wall, her glowing eyes dimming. James rushed to her side, catching her before she fell. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of amazement and fear. "I told you," she said weakly. "My people, we have a connection to the universe. I used the wreck's energy to protect us." James helped her into the co-pilot's seat, his mind racing. "You just turned a pile of junk into a weapon. That's not something I see every day." "It's dangerous," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I use my power, they can trace it. We don't have much time before more come." James nodded, his expression grim. "Then we'd better keep moving." As the Eclipse powered up and left the wreck field behind, James couldn't help but glance at Lyra. For all her calm and power, there was a deep sadness in her eyes, a weight she carried that went far beyond her status as a princess. "We'll figure this out," James said, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "You're not alone in this." Lyra looked at him, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. "Thank you." But as the stars stretched into streaks of light with the jump to hyperspace, James knew the battle was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. Sacrifice and betrayal. The air inside the Eclipse was heavy with tension. James sat at the navigation console, staring at the blinking star map in front of him. Lyra was in the back, seated in silence, her glowing green eyes dim with exhaustion. They had been running for days, hopping from one star system to another, but their enemies were relentless. James broke the silence. "We can't keep this up, Lyra. Every time we jump, they find us. We need a plan." Lyra's voice came from behind him, soft but steady. "There's only one way to end this. I have to face them." James spun his chair around, his face incredulous. "Face them? Are you insane? They'll kill you, or worse." "I know," she said, stepping closer. "But if I don't, they'll never stop. Not until they destroy everything and everyone in their path." James stood, his frustration boiling over. "So what? You just give yourself up? That's your brilliant plan?" "No," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm not giving up. I'm ending this. I know their leader, and I know where he's hiding. If I confront him directly, I can stop this." James folded his arms. "And what happens to you in the process?" Lyra didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said enough. She wasn't planning on coming back. "Not happening," James said firmly. "We'll figure something else out." Lyra hesitated, then reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already done so much for me, James. More than I ever expected. But this is my fight." Before James could argue, a sharp alarm blared through the ship. The radar lit up with a single, massive blip. A Dreadnought-class warship had just dropped out of hyperspace. "Of course," James muttered, rushing to the cockpit. He scanned the radar and groaned. "It's their flagship." Lyra's face turned pale. "They found us." James fired up the engines, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here. Now." But before the Eclipse could make its jump, a beam of energy struck the ship, disabling its engines. The lights flickered, and a cold, metallic voice echoed through the comms. "Princess Lyra, surrender yourself, or we will destroy the vessel." James clenched his fists. "They're bluffing. They want you alive." "Not if they think I'm too much of a threat," Lyra said, her voice trembling slightly. "They'll destroy everything to stop me." James turned to her, his jaw set. "Then we don't give them the chance." Before Lyra could respond, the ship's systems crackled, and the energy beam began pulling the Eclipse toward the massive dreadnought. James grabbed his plasma pistol and turned to Lyra. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not letting them take you. We're getting out of this." "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. James smirked, a reckless gleam in his eyes. "I've got a plan. You're not gonna like it." Moments later, the Eclipse was locked in the Dreadnought's hangar, its ramp lowering slowly. James and Lyra stepped out, surrounded by armed soldiers in black armor. At the center of the hangar stood a tall figure in ornate robes, his face hidden behind a mask. His voice was deep and commanding. "Princess Lyra," he said, stepping forward, "you've caused me quite a bit of trouble." Lyra stood tall, her glowing eyes defiant. "You won't win, Altrax. My people will rise against you." Altrax chuckled. "Your people are scattered and broken. You're the last hope of a dying empire." James stepped forward, drawing Altrax's attention. "Hey, pal. You're forgetting about me." Altrax turned to him, his tone amused. "And who are you exactly? Her pet human?" James grinned. "Something like that." In one swift motion, he raised his plasma pistol and fired at the hangar's control panel. Sparks flew as the magnetic shielding that held the hangar's atmosphere in place flickered and failed. Alarms blared, and the soldiers scrambled as the air began venting into space. Lyra's eyes widened. "James, what are you doing?" "Buying you time," he said, grabbing her arm. "Go." "No," she shouted, but James pushed her toward a small maintenance shuttle docked nearby. "You're the one they want," he said, his voice firm. "You get out of here, and I'll hold them off." Lyra hesitated, tears forming in her glowing eyes. "I can't leave you." James gave her a lopsided grin. "You don't have a choice, princess. Now go." With a final look, Lyra climbed into the shuttle. James turned back to face Altrax, his pistol raised, a determined fire in his eyes. "All right," he said, aiming at the soldiers. "Let's dance." The comeback. The Eclipse limped through the void, its engine sputtering as sparks flew from exposed wires in the cockpit. James gritted his teeth, piloting the damaged ship toward the edge of the system. His body ached from the fight, and his missing arm throbbed like a phantom reminder of everything he'd sacrificed. But his mind wasn't on himself, it was on Lyra. She was gone, taken by Altrax's forces. He could still see her face in his mind, the way her glowing green eyes pleaded with him before the dreadnought's shields closed between them. He'd barely managed to escape the chaos, but the cost had been high. Now, floating in a half-dead ship, James had one thought. He wasn't going to leave her to die. The comms unit crackled to life, startling him from his thoughts. A familiar voice, gravelly and tinged with annoyance, cut through the static. "Well, if it isn't Captain One-Arm. Didn't expect to hear from you again." James groaned. "Nice to hear your charming voice too, Corin. I need your help." Corin was a rogue alien smuggler James had worked with years ago, an 8-foot-tall reptilian with a bad attitude and worse habits. If anyone could help him pull off an insane rescue mission, it was Corin. Though James wasn't sure if Corin would shoot him first or laugh at his desperation. "Help. You've got some nerve calling me after the last time you ditched me," Corin growled. "What's in it for me?" James clenched his jaw. "I saved your tail back on Andros Prime. You owe me." Corin laughed, a deep guttural sound. "Owe you? That was 3 cycles ago. But fine, I'm listening. What mess have you gotten yourself into this time?" "It's not just me," James said, his voice sharp. "They've got someone. Someone important." "Let me guess. Important to you," Corin said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Human attachment is so predictable." James ignored the jab. "She's an alien princess, the Thalirian heir, and if we don't get her back, Altrax will use her to power some kind of doomsday weapon." There was a long pause. Then Corin let out a low whistle. "A princess, huh? You don't aim low, do you?" "I'm not in the mood, Corin," James snapped. "Are you in or not?" The smuggler chuckled. "Fine. But you owe me big for this, Captain. Meet me at the edge of the Yarvok belt. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve." Hours later, James docked the Eclipse with Corin's heavily armed freighter. The alien smuggler greeted him with a toothy grin, his sharp scales glinting under the dim cargo bay lights. "You look worse than I remember," Corin said, eyeing James's missing arm. "What happened? Lose a bar fight?" Something like that, James muttered. Let's focus on the mission. Corin led him to a holomap of the dreadnought where Lyra was being held. This ship is a fortress, Corin said, pointing to its layered defenses. Even with my firepower, getting in and out won't be easy. It's never easy, James said, studying the map. But I've got a plan. He explained his idea. A daring infiltration using Corin's freighter as a decoy to distract the dreadnought's defenses, while James snuck aboard through an old maintenance hatch. Corin raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You really think you can pull this off with one arm? Corin asked. I don't have to be perfect, James said. I just have to be fast. The plan was set. Corin's freighter approached the dreadnought, broadcasting fake credentials. As expected, the flagship's defenses lit up, but Corin's ship fired first, launching an explosive volley that threw the dreadnought into disarray. Meanwhile, James piloted a small stealth shuttle toward the maintenance hatch. His heart pounded as he navigated through the dreadnought's blind spots, avoiding patrols and automated turrets. All right, Lyra, he muttered to himself. Hold on, I'm coming. He docked the shuttle and entered the ship through the hatch. The cramped corridors lit with a faint, sterile glow. The air felt heavy, and the sound of distant alarms echoed through the halls. James moved quickly, his plasma pistol in hand, following the schematic Corin had provided. As he turned a corner, he nearly ran into a patrol of 2 guards. Reacting on instinct, he fired twice, the shots striking true and dropping them silently. He grabbed one of their keycards and pressed on, his determination outweighing his exhaustion. Finally, he reached the detention wing. Through a reinforced glass door, he saw Lyra. She was restrained in a glowing containment field, her head bowed, her energy visibly drained. Lyra, he called out. Her head snapped up, her green eyes widening in disbelief. James, what are you doing here? Saving your royal butt, he said with a grin, swiping the keycard to deactivate the field. The alarms grew louder as Lyra stepped forward, her legs unsteady. You shouldn't have come. It's too dangerous. Yeah, well, I've never been good at listening, James said, supporting her as they moved toward the exit. Let's get out of here. But just as they reached the corridor, a shadow loomed ahead. Altrax stepped into view, his imposing frame blocking their path. He held a glowing weapon, its energy pulsing ominously. You should have stayed away, Altrax said, his voice cold and cruel. Now you've both sealed your fate. James raised his pistol, his jaw tightening. We'll see about that. The final stand. The air inside the dreadnought's command chamber was thick with tension, the faint hum of its massive doomsday weapon vibrating through the walls. James stood at the center of the room, his pistol aimed at Altrax, who loomed over him like a living shadow. Behind Altrax, Lyra was shackled to a glowing pedestal, her energy siphoned into the weapon that pulsed ominously above them. The room was massive, its high ceilings lined with alien machinery and crackling energy conduits. The weapon's core, an orb of blinding light, hung suspended in the center, its energy growing more unstable with every second. You're too late, human, Altrax said, his deep voice echoing in the chamber. The weapon is nearly ready. With her power, I will bring this galaxy to its knees. James smirked, though his heart was pounding. Big speeches are nice, but you've got one problem, pal. Altrax tilted his head. And what's that? James cocked his pistol, his voice dripping with defiance. You're stuck in here with me. Before Altrax could respond, James fired at a nearby console. Sparks flew as the room plunged into chaos. Altrax snarled and lunged forward, but James was already moving, diving behind a massive control panel for cover. The warlord's blade, a jagged weapon glowing with deadly energy, sliced through the air, narrowly missing him. James. Lyra's voice rang out, filled with both fear and determination. The weapon, it's unstable. If it fires, it'll destroy everything within this system. Great, James muttered under his breath. No pressure. From his position, James could see the control panel that powered Lyra's restraints. It was heavily guarded by automated turrets mounted on the walls. He peeked out, firing a few quick shots to draw Ultrax's attention before ducking back behind cover. "Is that all you've got?" Ultrax taunted, his voice cold and calculating. "I expected more from the man who dared to defy me." James grinned, despite the odds. "Oh, don't worry. I'm just getting started." Meanwhile, Lyra closed her eyes, focusing on the faint threads of energy still coursing through her. The shackles were draining her power, but not fast enough to stop her entirely. She took a deep breath, her glowing eyes snapping open as she reached out with her mind. The conduits above her began to flicker, and the energy core trembled slightly. James noticed the change and called out to her. "Whatever you're doing, Princess, keep doing it." Lyra didn't respond, her concentration razor-sharp. The weapon's energy began to destabilize further, sending shockwaves through the chamber. Ultrax staggered slightly, his gaze shifting between James and the weapon. "You're a fool," Ultrax growled. "If that core collapses, it'll kill all of us, including her." James shrugged, stepping out of cover. "Better that than letting you destroy the galaxy." He fired again, this time hitting one of the conduits connected to Lyra's restraints. The shackle around her left hand released with a loud clunk, and Lyra gasped as a surge of power returned to her. Ultrax roared in fury and charged at James. The warlord's blade slashed down, but James rolled to the side, grabbing a loose pipe from the floor and using it to block the next attack. Sparks flew as the blade met the metal, the force nearly knocking James off his feet. "You're outmatched, human," Ultrax snarled, pressing his advantage. "Yeah," James said through gritted teeth, pushing back against the blade. "But I'm not out of tricks." With a sudden twist, James used his cybernetic arm's grappling mechanism, now reattached and sparking slightly, to latch onto one of the overhead conduits. He yanked himself upward, flipping over Ultrax's head and landing near the control panel for Lyra's restraints. Without hesitating, he slammed his fist onto the release button. The final shackle unlocked, and Lyra fell to her knees. Energy surged around her, wild and uncontrolled, as she rose to her feet. Her eyes glowed brighter than ever, her power no longer restrained. "Ultrax," she said, her voice echoing with an unnatural force. "This ends now." The warlord turned to face her, his confidence faltering. "You can't stop the weapon, Princess. It's already too late." Lyra extended her hands toward the weapon's core, her energy colliding with its unstable power. The room shook violently as she poured everything she had into destabilizing it further. "James," she shouted, "get out of here." "No chance," he called back, rushing to her side. "We're doing this together." James grabbed a nearby cable and attached it to the core's energy conduit, redirecting the power surge back into the weapon. Sparks rained down as the core began to collapse in on itself. Ultrax let out a furious roar, charging toward them. But before he could reach them, Lyra unleashed a blast of pure energy, sending him flying into the far wall. He slumped to the ground, motionless. The weapon's core began to implode, its light growing blindingly bright. James grabbed Lyra's hand. "Time to go, Princess." She nodded, her strength nearly spent. Together, they ran for the exit, dodging falling debris as the dreadnought began to tear itself apart. They barely made it to an escape pod as the weapon detonated, a massive burst of light engulfing the dreadnought. The pod rocketed away, and James and Lyra watched from the viewport as the explosion lit up the void, taking Ultrax's fleet with it. Lyra leaned back, her glowing eyes dim but peaceful. "It's over." James smiled, exhaustion written all over his face. "Yeah, but don't expect me to save any more princesses. This one nearly killed me." Lyra laughed softly. "Thank you, James, for everything." He leaned back, staring out at the stars. "Anytime, Princess, anytime."